Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kieran. I work at the University of Manchester Career Service. I'm pleased to welcome you today to this session, which is part of our Asia Careers Insight series, a series of workshops and employers sessions taking place throughout the month of March. I'm delighted to have here with me today Stephen Isherwood from the Institute of Student Employers to give you his valuable insights on the UK labour market. I'd like to say a special thank you to the University of Leeds for helping us arrange this session. And without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Stephen for his presentation. We'll be taking questions at the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction. So I'll just give you a bit of background in terms of who I am and who the ISE are, so you can give you a bit of a clear idea where our data comes from. So I'm Chief Exec of the ISE. I've been doing this job for about 8 years. The ISE is the Institute of Student Employers, so we are the trade body for employers of students, mostly graduates, but also in the sort of emerging apprentice school leaver market as well. We've got about 250 employers that are members, and a lot of the data and analysis that I talk to will come from the sort of the market research, the content we deliver, and the networks that we run with that employer group. Of course, we also have universities that are members. And also we have suppliers to the industry that are members as well. So also our data calls on those stakeholders. My own personal background: before I did this job, I used to run student recruitment for EY in the UK and Ireland. Did that for about 7 years. Before that, I ran programs across the whole graduate student space. Worked at PwC for a number of years. That's where I started my trip. So I've been in the sort of in this area for around about 20 years now. So and hopefully some of that experience actually will not only be of use to you in terms of how employers recruit, what they're thinking, but also I worked through a couple of recessions. So although the pandemic is very different to situations that we faced in the past, and obviously there's a huge amount of shock to people's lives and lots of difficulties people are dealing with, some of the economic forces that are impacting the economy, actually I think we can draw some lessons that apply to possibly how we might come out of this in the future. We've got time for questions at the end, so please populate the questions box on the platform as we go through, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can within the hour. So let's get stuck into the content. So I called this presentation Down But Not Out. If you can see me glancing off to the side, it's because I'm running two monitors, and actually my main slides are on that slide, so it's not that I'm staring aimlessly out the window. So actually I'm looking at the slide deck that you're seeing on your screens. So yeah, so down but not out, and that's because yes, this is a tough and challenging jobs market. There are issues, there are fewer vacancies than there are normally, but actually often it's not as bad as people think it is. Broadly, we think 85% of normal recruitment activity is continuing as planned. So there are an awful lot of employers out there recruiting. Also, there are a lot of employers who are gearing up to increase their recruitment as we come out of the pandemic and the market improves. So that's why we call that's why I call the presentation Down But Not Out. So reflecting on where we're at so far, I won't do a huge amount of history, a big history lesson for you all. We all know what's broadly going on in various economies, not just in the UK, but around the world, and real challenges there. And we've seen stock markets fall and then recover a little bit. We've seen some sectors hit really hard. We've seen some retail business, some travel businesses actually go out of business. So it has been very difficult, and probably the biggest recession, global recession we've seen since Second World War. So what does that mean for graduate vacancies? So at the start I said that roughly we think the overall graduate market is down by around about 10 to 15%. But one of the key things I think for you all to understand is that when we talk about the graduate jobs market, we tend to generalize, and there's a real challenge with generalizing, because actually what we're talking about are a whole range of different sectors, different employers, different size of employers, and they're all impacted differently. So if you look at this slide, this is the data that came that we pulled together in October in the run up to Christmas, asking employers both where they ended up last year, and also what they're expecting to do coming into this year. And let's start on the bad news first. So sectors that I've already mentioned: retail, FMCG, that's fast moving consumer goods organizations, travel industries, of course very badly hit by the downturn in revenue. So they've been cutting their vacancies by roughly half. Remember these stats to think about the flip statistic as well, though. So although that says down by half, that means even in those difficulties, there was still some recruitment going on, half vacancies, very much running as planned. And of course, different retailers within different sectors are impacted differently. So a food retailer actually may actually still be recruiting very strongly because there's a huge demand for their products. A bricks and mortar fashion retailer still very much relying on the high street, obviously in a very different situation. And then also you've got to remember that different businesses are just actually on a stronger financial footing than other businesses. So some businesses, went into the pandemic not carrying debt, not with big rents, etc., to service. So actually, again, they're in a better position to ride this through. So don't just think about the sector, also think about individual employers. I won't go through every sector individually, but the numbers there speak for themselves. Once we get to the professional service areas, finance, banking, big accountancy, insurance, those kind of industries, actually the market there is broadly flat. I think it's safe to say a slight decrease in some of their vacancies, but also some other sectors within those businesses doing quite well. Because remember, for some organisations, actually within the organisation, there's a whole bunch of different roles. Don't forget that a big four organisation does audit, it does tax, but also does consultancy and has digital tech services. A health and pharmaceuticals organisation not only recruits into the medical side of their business, it also hires people to do marketing, general management. So I'll come back to that theme a little bit later. The sector that is doing best in terms of vacancies is the public sector. So within our membership, we have programs like the Civil Service Fast Stream, local central government, but also some of those newer ways to get into some public sector roles, like, for example, teaching through Teach First, policing through Police Now, prison services through Unlocked. And the government has been actually increasing the amount of people it hires through those programs because they're very successful at getting graduates into organisations. So that's the picture at the moment in terms of vacancies. The one thing I will say is we're in regular contact to all sorts of employers. We talk on a daily basis, and actually for some organisations they talk about pent-up demand, and by that I mean they've got business units who are expecting, when the recovery comes, for there to be quite a big increase in demand on their services. They are expecting to have to come to the market pretty quickly for graduate vacancies. So it might well be that in the late spring, early summer, actually there's quite a bit of graduate recruitment activity happening for employers that want students to start with their normal September intakes. Let's talk a little bit now about how employers have changed their recruitment practice. So I've already said that lots of employers are continuing to recruit, but of course what employers can't do really is pull themselves into interviews and assessment centres on their premises. So what employers have done over the last year is switch to virtual recruitment. I was on we had our regular team meeting this morning, and I was reminiscing that it is pretty much a year ago to the day that Boris announced the lockdown. Actually, at that stage, there were employers who were getting ready to bring people into their businesses for spring weeks in Easter, and were gearing up to their summer internship programs. They were still recruiting, and they had to pivot pretty quickly to be able to continue with that recruitment despite the lockdown restrictions. So employers have learned a lot around how to do hiring online. And what they've done, and some of this was happening anyway, so even before the pandemic. So those of you that have been involved in, hunting for jobs, may well have come across things like video interviews, online assessments, a lot of those activities that were pretty common before the pandemic anyway. What's really changed over the last year is the assessment centre end of the selection process. So what most employers normally do, they'll use a mixture of interviews and first interviews and testing in the early stages to whittle candidates down to a final pool that they would then often bring in for an assessment centre that would be done in person. And of course that wasn't possible in lockdown, so what employers have done is switch that to online. So worked very hard, used a range of online assessment tools and processes that they switched to an online format, many of them using tools like Zoom, other platforms we've all become very familiar with to run assessment center type exercises or exercises that were similar to the kind of things they would have done in person and run those online. And employers have been pretty successful at that. They had to move pretty fast to be able to do it, but lots of employers have become pretty comfortable around how they do that. So as a student, that means that actually you need to adapt to that different way of recruitment happening and understand, what's different, what's changed, what are the kind of different exercises that you might have to prepare for. But the one thing I would say is that at the core of this, what employers are looking for when they recruit hasn't changed. Those core competencies, core skills they're looking for, and at the heart of a lot of these exercises, the tools they use to assess those in yourselves, they haven't changed. But I'll come back to the skills piece just a little bit later. I mentioned briefly the whole work experience placements piece. Lots of employers were gearing up, as I said, to do Mr. Spring Week programs and their summer program when the pandemic hit, and lots of those programs were obviously cancelled. The short notice, the difficulty of doing that online, being able to replace it, employers just quite often weren't able to deal with that when you consider all the other pressures we're under as well. But not all programs were cancelled. Some employers did manage to shift their programs online, particularly those businesses that were able to adapt very quickly to remote working. And lots of organisations, have workforces that were doing a lot of remote working anyway. There are lots of businesses where their employees spend a lot of their time out on clients, not in an office. So there were employees that were to carry on very much as normal. If you look at our website, our website is geared towards that employer and university audience, but you'll see examples on their employers like IBM, Aon, who ran their internship or placement programs virtually. They delivered laptops to people at home, got people on their systems, did inductions, and very much ran their normal programs. 1 year placement still happening, 6-week internship programs. But that was, to be honest, that was the exception. I don't want to say that everybody was doing that, because organisations just didn't have the resources to be able to deliver that. But what we have seen, an increase in virtual options. So some employers were able to do shortened, they weren't really internship experiences, but they were online work-based activity. So they might have been skills training, could have been giving projects for people to do virtually, providing online mentoring and coaching in place of an internship program. And some of those lasting over a couple of days, some of them maybe lasting over 1 or 2 weeks. And there are a number of platforms out there that still have a lot of those kind of activities on it. Because of course, one of the advantage of creating stuff that get delivered online is that it can stay there. So if you created some skills-based training, actually, it doesn't have to be just delivered as a one-off. It's something that people can access over time. My analysis of what's going to happen this year, so talking to employers at the moment, I think a lot of internships are going to stay online. I think this picture that we saw last summer is also going to be the picture for this summer. Although the vaccine program is rolling out, we're seeing lockdown being started to ease. My daughter's back to school today, which she was very pleased to get back to school. So I started to see that easing of lockdown. But I think the reality is for employers, it's still very uncertain how the offices will reopen, and there's also the safety side of things. So at what point will everybody be vaccinated? At what point will employers think it's safe to bring people back into their organizations, particularly if they're coming from external sources, i.e. the student market. So I think this year will still be very much a virtual year. The employers I talk to are talking about how do they do kind of programs online. So like I said, do keep your eyes and ears open for those programs. They are out there. They might look a little bit different to they would do normally, but still make use of those activities because they will help in your preparation for the world of work. So I mentioned a little ago about talking about the whole skills piece and what does it employers recruit to, because it is really important that you understand how employers recruit, the tools they use, so that you can prepare yourself for those. But I think it's even more important to get your head around what is it that employers are looking for. Why do they create these selection processes? What are they designed to assess in yourselves as individuals? And that's what I want to talk to you about now. I'm conscious that quite a few of on this webinar might be international students. And the first thing I want to say is that the UK graduate labour market is quite different to most other countries that I've got experience of working in. And that is that most employers don't really specify a degree subject when they're hiring people. They don't only target students from a specific degree background. So I can say that from my own experience, knowing the Big Four sector very well, the accountancy, professional services sector. You didn't have to have an accounting and finance degree to apply for those roles. In fact, the percentage of graduates with an accounting and finance degree was pretty small, about 10%. 40% of your average intake into an organisation like that, into a law firm, have a degree that's absolutely nothing to do with the job whatsoever. And that, I mean, we could do a whole session on that, why that is, but that's very much the way that employers think about the graduate market. There are some that do, so I'm not saying every employer thinks that way. If you want to be an engineer, it's highly likely you'll need an engineering degree. But let's take the digital sector, for example. There are a lot of employers out there who look for students who have an interest in working in a digital role, may look for some evidence of a bit of work experience maybe, or a special interest in that area, but they don't necessarily recruit from computer science type degrees. They'll often look to a much broader range of subjects than those. So that's one area that's also worth doing your homework on the type of sector you want to go into and the types of qualifications that sector wants. But most employers don't really care what it is that you studied as a subject. So they're not going to focus on your degree subject. What are they going to be thinking about and asking about? And that's where we get onto the right hand side of this slide, and that's the knowledge, skills and abilities that you can bring to an organization. And you can wrap all that up into your potential. What potential have you got that start to develop and grow within that organizations? Different organizations under those different three headings will have a sort of a different balance of things that they are looking for. And it's very easy to get sort of wrapped up into the language of skills and HR language, and the pitch can get quite confusing. So what I want to do now is just demystify some of that a little bit. I get asked an awful lot, what are the skills of the future? How is that going to change for employers? And I think that's a really difficult thing to predict, actually, because quite knowing how jobs will change, how the labour market will change over the years and decades to come. There's a graveyard of people making very strong predictions that don't turn out to be true. But if I start with this slide, so this is the World Economics Forum. They've done this work a number of times, and it's very well respected work. And this talks about the future of jobs. And actually what this slide shows is where employers are increasing their ask of certain skills groups. So actually, if you look at this, the dark blue bar shows actually where there's an increase in the kind of skills that they're after. And it's interesting, if you look at the top of this list, it's not subject specific criteria. So it's about how you think, how you solve problems. It's about how you manage yourself, how you work with people. Technology and use of technology in there, is an important factor, but it's not the only factor that's there. So that's what the WF is saying across all industries and globally well. I quite like this from Nesta. They're a UK organisation in the technology space, and this is what they think. So they think this combination of strong project management and organisational skills, when combined with creativity, will be a particularly potent mix in the future. And I think when we talk about technology, there's an interesting conversation happening, and I don't think there's a clear answer yet. Some say that actually AI will take away a lot of the highly technical jobs. Computers will do that stuff for themselves, but actually what will be needed is actually people with the people skills to solve problems, identify problems, create new products and services that technology will be able to facilitate. And you look at this quote, the ability to see projects through and get things delivered in a complex world will be particularly important. There are other people say, I was at a presentation a couple of years ago in the US, and the presenter said that actually everybody should learn to code. If you don't know how to code, then actually you don't know what technology is capable of. So there are different views out there, which I think again plays to that point where it's very difficult to say yes in 5 or 10 years time this is what the economy will be looking for. So I've quoted some global external data. We all ask employers ourselves, and again I won't go into this slide in a huge amount of detail. It does mirror some of those findings from the World Economic Forum. So we ask employers, when you hire graduates, what do you think about the skills they've got? Think about the skills they haven't got, and did you expect that? And is there a bit there where actually you've had some graduates and they didn't quite have the skill mix that you thought they would? I think the key thing to remember is that employers actually, when they're hiring graduates, early talent, the phrase early talent has become very common over recent years. Employers know they're hiring individuals with limited work experience. That's just the nature of the beast. If I apply for a job, I've got 20 years of experience, I've done various jobs, and that in itself tells a story. When I was applying for as a graduate, I didn't necessarily have particular work experience that I could talk to about. So going back to that piece, what are employers looking for? How are they assessing potential and skills? This is what they're looking for. So the green bars here, that says actually where employers saying students have this skill. And even in areas, we look at the very top one, managing up, only 5% of employers say that the graduates they hire have skills around how to manage upwards, how to deal with bosses and senior leaders and all that kind of stuff. But actually that black bar says they lack the skill, but we expect this lack. So that's employers saying, do you know what? We know we're hiring students, so things like managing up, dealing with conflicts, negotiating, those aren't the kind of experiences coming out of university is likely to have much experience in. So we train that. These are the areas we train in. I think the interesting thing on this graph is showing where there's a gap. So that pink bar, and that says where, remember, these are graduates that employers have hired. This is where saying they lack this skill, but actually we thought they'd be a bit better than they are at this. And that's where we see things like self-awareness, resilience. If you remember that WF slide that was talking about self-management, that's in this area. And then employers talking about, ability to deal with difficult situations, to deal with change, to deal with the ambiguity of business organizational life. The self-awareness to know that actually this is where I need to grow, this is where I need to develop, this is something that I may be quite good at or not so good at and need to develop my skills in. That's where employers are telling us that that they think students could be a little bit better. So what does that mean for the workplace? There's lots of HR language in those slides that I've just shown you, so I always like to try and sort of break it down a little bit in terms of what is it really that employers are looking for when they're hiring young people. And I think you can sum that up in the first thing is around these people skills. So you'll hear people talk about teamwork skills. Teamwork is just about being able to get on with people, and have a nice, pleasant working relationship with people. It's about getting stuff done. It's about being productive. One of the slides I showed talked about dealing with conflict and negotiation. In an organizational environment, there are competing interests. There are differences of opinion. There's a whole sort of organization structure to deal with. I can't think of a single role really where people just very much work on their own and very deliver their own work without the influence of other people. So that teamwork stuff, the people stuff, is getting stuff done with other people, but in a positive teamwork kind of way. Practical intelligence. So employers recruit graduates because actually one of the things is if you've got a degree, that's a good indication that you've got a good brain. You can do a degree, you can deal with complex issues and problems. But I think the important thing is to think is employers want people to solve problems actually in the workplace. So that ability to deliver solutions that the employers need, whether it's public sector or private sector, an investment or a civil service. The world is complex, it's difficult, there are problems to be solved, and employers hire graduates and students because actually they will be able to bring that level of intelligence to solve those solutions. The third point here, I've used the word keenness. I think I use the word passion, but I think the word passion is overused sometimes. But I think it is really important that as you start to stand or think about what jobs it is you want to do, what careers you want to go in, it's important that you're really interested in that sector and you are keen, to get involved in the work that you're looking to do. Because if you're not, actually, there's challenge with that. One is you'll end up doing a job you don't want to do, and anybody doing a job they don't want to do, despite how hard they think they can do something, is always difficult, and people are unhappy and not performing quite so well. But also, actually, if you think of yourself in the employer point of view, and you've got a couple of candidates, the person that is kind of keen on the sector can demonstrate that they're keen on the kind of work they're going to do. I said my background is professional services, so commercial business, dealing with numbers, interested in finance. You're trying to find people who are interested in that because that's what they're going to be working with on a day in, day out basis. So it's really important. And that is a challenge in the UK market, because remember I said that most employers don't really care what you do study. So your subject choice isn't necessarily a predictor of what you may want to do. So if you can choose anything to do, how do you choose that? I'll come on to that in a minute, how you start to refine, what it is you think you should be focusing on. But that keenness is really important, choosing work that you are interested in. And I think the other thing is this resilience piece. And often the reason that employers are looking for, candidates that can demonstrate a certain level of resilience is because there's two things. Sometimes work is difficult. You've got challenging, difficult situations and difficult problems to deal with. Sometimes, and actually this goes for any job you could imagine, whatever level you could imagine, that sometimes you're just having to do dull work that you may not really want to do, but you have to grind your way through it. And the employers, want people with the resilience to do that and deal with those situations. I think one of the challenges for people transitioning from education into the world of work is that the world of work is very messy. There are often not clear answers. So you'll be working on situations, issues, challenges where there isn't necessarily an answer that you can pull back from the way this was done before. So it's being able to deal with that and being comfortable with failure. I think one of the realities of organisation life is that you don't get things right all the time, and that's generally okay as long as you don't really make the same mistake. I think that's one of the rules to follow. So it's having the resilience to deal with that difficult, kind of challenging environments that employers are looking for. So if you ever hear sort of employers saying things, we don't want people who just need to be spoon-fed or have their hand held all the way through, this is kind of what they're talking about in reality, even though that language may not be great. It's getting this balance right between, yes, joining an organization that's going to support you and develop you, but you've also got to bring yourself to that job and that role and make the most of it and do what it is that what your role requires. And I think that comes back to this keenness for chosen industry career piece. It's about knowing, when you're looking for a particular career or a particular organization, what's the bottom line of what that organization delivers? What are you ultimately trying to achieve? Because that's really the sort of the goals and values that you're buying into. So that's a little bit on the kind of skills and things that employers are looking for. So how do you develop those skills, and how do you start to get some self-awareness in terms of, so what am I good at? What should I do with my career? Maybe you're one of those lucky people that was very focused, from the moment you were born, you knew exactly what you wanted to do, very clear, and you followed that trajectory. And that's great. And there are people who absolutely, and I know them myself, they've always had a really good idea of what they wanted to do and been able to follow that path. But a lot of people don't know. And a lot of people actually go through a big chunk of their working lives not really knowing, because it's not always that easy to know what you're most suited at or what the perfect job is for you. So one of the ways to start thinking about this, and I've used the Socrates quote here, the unexamined life is not worth living. It is worth thinking about what you do and don't like doing. If you've got some work experience, no matter how menial, and this is another thing I think is important to get over, when you're talking to employers about sort of experiences that you have, it doesn't have to be from a placement or an internship program. In fact, there are nowhere near as many placement and internship jobs as there are graduate jobs. So a big chunk of people going to graduate jobs haven't done an internship in the role they're looking for. So internships aren't the be all and end all. But I know it's difficult at the moment, but in a normal situation, you might be doing part-time work in bars or restaurants. The stuff you do on campus in a normal year, volunteering, working in societies, being involved in sports clubs. So think about when you're doing stuff, and think about actually what it is what you enjoy doing. So when I was at university, the sports club I was involved in, I was the treasurer. And from doing that, I kind of, it showed that I kind of, it taught me that things need to be organized, the money needs to work, that kind of stuff. And it also showed me that, I was relatively interested. I didn't mind doing it. And some of those skills that I had to do that role, I was then able to talk about when I went to my first interview. If I hadn't have enjoyed doing that job, that would have been a good indicator to maybe think about doing something else. If you've been in a role where you really don't like overly working with people and dealing with people's problems. Now, every job has to a certain extent, but that might be an indication as to whether you should or maybe shouldn't pursue a career in HR. So think about these things. And also, as you're doing these activities, this is the self-awareness and the self-management piece. There's a very useful cycle to think about here as you're developing yourself and your skills. That is, you actually do something, and you observe yourself doing it. You pay attention to what you're doing it, what your thoughts are, how you did it, that reflection piece. And actually what you should use is that reflection piece is to start to think, is to plan around it. If this was you in the workplace, it's how you develop your skills. You do a task, you think about how well you did it. If you did it well or not so well, you might do it differently the next time. Act again and observe in that cycle. When it comes to your careers, you can think about actually all those experiences you've got that you might be related to careers environment, what you do, and make plans off the back of it. What is doing those activities taught you, that you can then apply to the world of work and what employers are looking for. When you're doing those activities, it is okay to make mistakes, because actually it's through getting things wrong and making mistakes that often you get your best learning. I don't really interview students nowadays. It's a while since I've doing that. But if I was interviewing a candidate and I'd been asking about, examples of where they worked with people, examples of where they'd solved complex problem, and I was always getting really good answers, the great candidate, I'd sometimes say, well, okay, well, tell me when you've made a mistake, when something's gone wrong and you have to learn from it. And they've said to me, I've never made a mistake, everything's gone fine. I think of two things. Either the person's lying, because to have never had anything go wrong is pretty unheard of, so something must have, or actually they haven't pushed themselves, because actually it's only when you push yourselves and the boundaries of what you're capable of that you tend to make mistakes. It's when you put yourself in certain territory, when you kind of challenge yourself to do something you haven't done before, you are more than likely to make mistakes and get it wrong the first time, and then you do it differently the next time, and that's where the learning cycle kicks in. So it is okay to try different things, get it wrong, learn from it, and apply that to your thinking, because often it's through that process of trial and error that you start to understand what it is you really do want to do and are good at. So back in the day, I used to run internship programs. I mean, ideally, we'd hire interns with the view that they would join as graduates. That's why we invested in the program. But sometimes we'd have candidates who, they get through the selection process, they do a good internship program, but they say, do you know what? I can do this job, but it's just not for me. I want to do something else. And that actually was a good outcome, because what that did was save somebody investing a lot of time and effort in their own career, an area that they weren't going to enjoy, and also save the organisation investing in somebody who ultimately wasn't going to work out. So it's okay to make mistakes, and it's really important you get your learnings from those. I've used the image of a piece map on this slide to try and get over this idea that for most people their jobs aren't linear. It doesn't all go in a straight line the way that maybe it used to. For most people, the job for life, the career for life, the employer for life is very much a thing of the past. Having said that, some people do stay in the same organisation for very long periods of time, but quite often they do different jobs. If I again go back to my experience of working in Big Four partnerships, if you had the ambition to really get to that partner level, that senior level, you could not get to those levels if you hadn't done as comment of some description to do something different, worked in a business unit, maybe worked abroad. So quite often career trajectories look a bit like a piece map. It's sometimes you're going up, sometimes you're just going along plateauing, sometimes you're going down a bit to go back up again because you're making a bit of a career change. And that has become more and more common as roles change much more quickly. In life cycles. If you think about people who've worked in the printing trades over the last 20 years, you've gone from when everything used to be printed, newspapers, magazines, they were printed in a very manual way. You had the first wave of digital printing, which made it a lot more automated, which took away again a lot of those skills that were needed. A lot more stuff was digitally. Then, of course, with so much more being delivered online now, actually those skills shifted again, and even less was needed by actual. So if you were running a printing business, producing publications, actually your world has changed significantly over the last 20 years. And if you didn't change with the industry, you will have most definitely gone out of business. And the same applies to many different careers. And sometimes those evolutions are more subtle. Sometimes they can happen, very much overnight. When technology all of a sudden changes in industries. Sometimes it's more subtle and over a period of time. So it's really important you think about your career in that way. You may start off on a career journey and get to the point where you think, I've enjoyed it so far, I've learned a lot, but actually, this isn't for me. I want to go and do something else now. And not only is that a lot more common, actually that's thought of a lot positively amongst employers, and it's not necessarily the blight on CVs that it would have been if you go back a few decades ago. So don't worry if all I'm saying, if what I'm saying makes you think I've got to get this right, my first job has got to be the one. If I get that wrong, I'm screwed the rest of my corporate life. That's not what I'm saying at all. There are lots of people I've come across who didn't know what they wanted to do for their first job and just kind of fell into a role. And if I'm totally honest, that's what happened with me. I was doing a part-time job as I was graduating, doing some admin for one of the big consultancy firms in their recruitment department. That became a full-time temp job. It then became a secondment into a graduate team and then a permanent job, and 20 years later here I am still doing it. And if I'm honest, that kind of happened by accident, but I had opportunities to do other things, but I chose not to do them because I'd found my right niche. There are other people that things out for a couple of years before they really land on what they want to do. So don't be afraid about that career not being linear in the way it would have been in the past, and be prepared be prepared for that need to adapt, be flexible, and very much really keep learning. That's one of the things I hear about employers talking about a lot of the time nowadays, that need to developing, keep learning, keep growing. That's what will help you, both your job stay interesting, also your career stay on track. Just going back to the graduate vacancies market at the moment, as I said at the beginning, it is a tough market out there. There are fewer jobs, but we did this piece of work just mapping out graduate vacancies over the 18 years before Brexit was due to happen. That's what we were thinking about really just over a year ago. And I was saying I'd worked through a number of recessions, which I have. If you go back to the financial crash 2007, 2008, yes, we did see a significant drop in vacancies. But when you look at that drop compared to the overall market, it didn't affect anything like the whole market or all employers, and it quite quickly stabilized. My view is that coming out of the pandemic, actually we will see a quicker upturn in vacancies as business bounce backs very, very quickly, and I think we'll see a lot of government efforts and investment put into making the economy bounce back as quickly as we can. So that goes back to my point of no matter how difficult it is, remain positive about the jobs market. It is tough out there, but don't let that make you think that you've got to just kind of step away from the market. There's nothing you can do for a couple of years. So just a couple of slides to wrap up, and then we should have some time for, we've got quite a quarter of an hour for questions. So just a little bit of advice really, sort of wrapping up the things we've been talking about. So it is a difficult jobs market, but be pragmatic, be aware that it's a difficult jobs market. You're probably going to have to make more applications, you're going to have to try harder to get a job, you're going to get more rejections, but do stay engaged in that job market and try and stay positive. What we haven't seen happen over the last couple of years compared to the financial crash is most employers have stuck with the offers they made, whereas in the financial crash and the dot-com burst before, we saw more employers withdrawing offers. So stay positive and really try not to be disengaged, like I said, to think, right, I'll just ignore this for a couple of years. Do stay engaged in the jobs market, developing yourself. Those skills I talked about, yes, it is harder to develop them when you can't do things like part-time work and the stuff you used to. But as I said, there's lots of stuff you can do online. I know students that have been doing volunteering work, all those kind of activities, stuff in their local community. That is stuff you can talk to employers about because it shows you being proactive, and there'll be learnings you'll get from that stuff. I know some students who found part-time work where they're able to do it remote, do it online for organisations in a whole bunch of different sectors. So like I said, do guard against that disengagement piece. Think flexibly. The great advantage of the fact that employers don't really focus on what you studied is there are a whole range of opportunities out there. The point I made here, everybody recruits tech. If you do want to work in the tech digital space, every organisation you can think of needs techies in some way, shape or another. And lots of organisations think, they do nothing to do with technology. They actually may well have a graduate technology scheme. Same for finance, same for marketing, same for HR, same for a whole bunch of other different functions. Don't think of the function necessarily by the type of employer. Think about the function and the work that you want to do. That's the important way to think about it. I mentioned online recruitment, lots of stuff online. Your career service will be really helpful with that. Other tools out there, online recruitment is a bit different. The principles are broadly the same, but you can practice for that online recruitment. I asked a lot about postgraduate study, again, particularly from international students. I'm a fan of postgraduate study. I've got a postgraduate qualification myself. The one thing I will say though is that most employers don't necessarily pay a premium for postgraduates. They don't actively recruit postgraduates. What they will do is they will just treat you the same as a graduate application. So if you're going to do postgraduate qualification, go into it with your eyes open. If you want to do it just for the love of the subject, nothing wrong with that at all. But be aware that not all employers place a premium on it. There are some that do. We talked about the pharma sector a bit earlier. If you want to be an occupational psychologist, various career routes where you do need that postgraduate study to get on. But there are some where actually it may necessarily help your career. So get clear advice if that is something that you are thinking about. And then really just a final comment to end on before we go to questions. And it is this piece about the future. I mean, if we go back just over a year ago, nobody really saw the pandemic coming. I mean, I remember listening to and now being interviewed on Bloomberg Radio Business News I listen to sometimes, and this was about 3 weeks before lockdown, and she said nobody has got their head around, nobody knows what's coming. She said this pandemic is going to be way bigger than everybody thinks it is, because she'd had experience of working in Asia, she had experience of SARS, and she said that the whole climate was different, the level of travel, the level of global trade, was fivefold what it was back then. So she did see it coming, but I think everyone else like me listening to that were like, yeah, it might be a little blip, but it'll go quite quickly. So you can't predict the future, but what you can do is develop that ability to deal with the change when it does hit you, because the one thing that we can predict about the future is that it's going to be unpredictable, and lots of it is going to come, and it'd be very difficult to imagine what that change is. So be flexible, be agile, think critically about developing your skills, and keep learning as your careers develop. So I think, what are we at now? So we are nearly 10 to 3, so we've got some time for questions. So we've got any questions we want to cover off?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Stephen. That's been a very insightful presentation. I've definitely learned loads. We've had plenty of questions come in from students. I'm going to try and summarize a few of them to hopefully answer as many of them as possible, because I'm conscious of the time. So quite a few students have asked around the pandemic, and we've already covered a little bit how the recruitment market has been affected since then. So a few students have asked whether the recruitment timelines have shifted, or you expect them to be shifted for the next academic year as well. And then if we can boil it down to like maybe one piece of advice, like what would you say current students can do currently to sort of like prepare themselves to be ahead of their competition in a more competitive jobs market?
Okay, so the first thing around vacancy, again, remember what I said about generalising. It's very easy to generalise the graduate jobs market, but general rules also can make you miss opportunities. So there are some employers that have had to, if you're in the travel business, you're not going to be recruiting at the moment, full stop. That's fairly obvious. There are some employers that I talk to that are holding back because either they haven't got the ability to bring people in at the moment, or they're just not too sure how quickly the financial implications of the pandemic are going to sort of progress and get better. Whereas you've got employers who are still recruiting actively, and some have pushed their time frames back. So there were some employers who might have been recruiting last autumn, and they only just started recruiting in the new year. Some have closed their vacancies early because there are more applications per vacancy. That is undeniable. So if you're going into the jobs market, be prepared for more rejections. Don't get put off by rejection. Just because you don't get through with one organisation doesn't mean you won't get through with another. So be flexible and keep going. But I think that if everything keeps going well in terms of the vaccine rollout, and with spring we start to see the economy open up, when I talk to employers, there is that pent-up demand. So I think there will be some quite a bit of activity in the jobs market. Most employers that we work with, they have sort of September, October start dates. Not all, some do recruit all year round. So if you look at Accenture's program, they do year-round recruitment and year-round starts. So different organisations different, but I do think there'll be a bit of a flurry of recruitment activity late spring, summertime, if things stay positive.
That sounds
the
great.
one tip.
So go on.
Yeah. Right, I was going to say, you asked about the one tip. I think that's a question I get asked the most, and I don't think there is really one thing. Everything that I've talked about in the last sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, I've tried to boil it down to the core principles. There is no one thing really that you can do that gives you an edge over somebody else. It's a combination of factors. It's doing your homework, finding the role that's right for you. Recruitment is much about finding the right person for an organisation as you finding the right role for you. But if I was to say one thing, particularly in the light of the pandemic, it would be to have a story to tell. And by story, I don't mean fiction. It's that when you do get that interview, even if it's a hard slog to get to that interview, and even if you don't get that interview for another 6 months or so, is be able to say, right, in the panic, it was a difficult situation, but here's what I did. Here's what I did to keep going. Here's what I did to develop my skills. Here's how I dealt with a difficult situation. The students that will do less well in those interviews, as they would do at any time in the recruitment cycle, the ones that go, oh, you know what, there was just nothing I could do. So really, I just focused on my studies. So everybody else. So yeah, so think about that. Have a good story to tell, about how you've dealt with a difficult situation and how you've still been able to keep developing and keep growing, etc.
Definitely a great way to show your resilience, creativity, and how you manage to like deal with difficult situations. So we had quite a few questions as well around how do employers in the UK compare to employers abroad. So you very briefly like touch upon how in the UK employers don't look at what degree you've done. So like so intensely, like that's not a hard requirement. And then specifically the students have asked whether in if like in employers outside of the UK, when there is a degree requirement for a role that in the UK that wouldn't normally exist, would you still recommend that they go for that role, or would you recommend that they abide by the employer's sort of like wishes in the job description?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. If an employer says so like I said, we say 85% of employers don't look at degree, but that does mean 15% do, and they do want a specific degree. So in earlier phases of my career, I was involved in recruiting actuaries, and employers do like with an actuarial science degree if you're recruiting actuaries. That doesn't have to be the only one. There's I think it's the Morse degree at Warwick on operational research, very high similar content that works. But if you're going to do that job, if you don't absolutely love numbers to the nth degree, you are not going to enjoy being an actuary. So there is a high relevance of degree subject to in that role, but lots of other jobs less so. So again, it's important doing your homework. I mentioned engineers. If you're going to be an engineer, because often your qualification then leads to professional qualification, so it's important you have an engineering degree. But again, if I go back to my life in professional services, even people who had an accounting and finance degree and had exceptions, they still had to do a 3-year training contract, and they still had to make sure they passed the professional exams. So sometimes they were a bit ahead of their peers. Sometimes they thought they knew all, so they weren't a bit ahead of their peers. So as I said, it's important to do the homework. The other thing I would say on wish lists of employers is wish list probably makes it sound a bit like, oh, it's just pulled out of thin air. But often when you look at what employers are looking for, also particularly if remember a lot of jobs, I tend to talk about jobs where it's an actual graduate trainee program, over 2 to 3 years, you recruit on. There are lots of graduate jobs that aren't quite so specific in that sense that they're a training program. They're graduate level jobs and they will train you, but maybe not in quite a structured way. And sometimes then the wish list is actually the ideal candidate might have all of these, but in reality, most people have 80% of them. And they'll be making a choice between, well, that person's got this, but not this. That person's got this, but not this. So do you know what? We think that person's the better fit. There is some data out there that shows that female students are slower to apply for graduate level jobs. And some of the thinking is that's because they won't apply for a job unless they know they can do 100% of everything that's on the job description. Whereas a male student might think, oh, do you know what? I can do half of it. I'll wing the rest. And I'm not. Both of those extremes are not good. You want to be somewhere in between those. So yeah. So be pragmatic around some of those job lists. You can always do it all, but it's actually it's knowing where the bound are and what you've got to have. And if you're a great fit for a role, you might not be the perfect candidate on paper, but actually there's something else that you can bring that's important.
Definitely, thank you. So I've got an interesting question here, which I've actually never considered before myself, is whether you've got any insights into recruitment agencies. Are they worth using for the students, or would you recommend they apply directly with an employer, or they look for jobs directly with employers?
Do both, and the reason being is because some employers they may be actually a big employer, but they might have a small graduate program. So actually what they don't have is an internal team that can do all the graduate recruitment work, and you apply direct. So apply for both, because actually it might be some organisations, like I said, that don't have a graduate team and so can't build graduate websites and application processes, so they do go through agencies. So if it's the right job, then yeah, don't be afraid of going through an agency, particularly climate like this where there are fewer jobs. So you are going to have to apply to more jobs, which is going to involve a bit more sort of legwork. I'm afraid that's just the way it is. So yeah, don't rule agencies out, because some employers, that it's the way they make up and not having a recruitment team. But again, everything else that I said about what's the right job for you, is it the right job? Remember, an agency gets their fee from placing you, so they're interested is in you starting and getting the job, which is good, but actually you don't want to end up in a job that maybe you want to do.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I know we've got quite a few other questions, but I'm very conscious of time, so I'll try and get to the very last question now. So quite a few students are interested to hear about what the recruitment market is going to look like specifically for international students in the next few coming months. So I know before we started the session, we talked a little bit more about how employers in the UK will potentially perceive the new graduate rule. Can you share some of your opinions on that with us?
Yeah, of course I can. Well, the first thing is to say in the UK, unless you've got a job whereby you can't bring international students, so let's something like the Ministry of Defence government, so there's no point applying to those jobs, because if you're an international worker, you can't work in this field. So ignore some of those very specialist roles, but there's such a small percentage of this market, and that's employers can't discriminate on the basis of you being an international student, so they have to look at your application. And again, not every organisation plays by the letter of the law. I can't pretend they do, but all our members do. The more professional organisation, the more likely they are to understand that kind of legislation. So that's the first to say. The other thing to say is that it depends on the employer, which I know I've said an awful lot. Some employers, so those of you that are asking this, I'm sure you're aware that the new graduate visa rules were announced last week, which means if you're an international student and you are graduating from a UK university, as long as you're in the country by, I think it's 27th of June, is that right?
I believe so.
You can work for 2 years. Yeah, you can work for 2 years in the UK without a visa, which is a great thing. Actually, that's something that we campaigned for. The challenge is, though, is that for a lot of employers, actually that visa isn't that useful to them. And it's because when the employers we work with are hiring graduates, they're hiring for the long term. They want somebody that's going to be here 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And there are a lot of training contracts out there. The agency training contract is a 3-year training contract. So a 2-year visa actually doesn't cover the whole period. So lots of employers we work with apply for people to get the skilled study visa, the skilled worker visa anyway, because what they don't want to be in is a situation whereas in 2 years' time, actually they can't get you a full visa and you have to come off their training program. So yeah, again, it really depends on different employers, different roles. Understand the employer, but what the graduate visa does do is give you a bit more flexibility about who you work for. It also means that you own the visa, the employer doesn't. With a skilled worker visa, the employer has to be a sponsoring employer and get the visa for you, whereas of course with the graduate visa you don't have that. And different employers, different roles will have different views on that. Again, do your homework. But remember, employers can't legally discriminate against international students, but just remember that some of them are going to try, they want to get you a skilled worker visa anyway. But, I mean, you can spend a whole hour on it. There's complications around salary levels as well for the skilled worker visa, because to get that visa you have to, but some of the good news is some of that bureaucracy has been taken away and the thresholds have been released, but that can also affect which roles are available for international students and which aren't. So do your homework again with your employer. But the graduate visa does make it a little bit easier, but don't assume that you might have to educate your employer about it. That's one of the things, particularly smaller employers that don't have a legal department, but it should make life at least a little bit easier.
Yeah, and just as a reminder to students, it will allow you to remain in the UK for 2 years after graduation, or 3 years if you're a PhD student, allowing you to work at any level of job. So it will be a perfect solution to anyone who's perhaps looking for some UK-based experience before returning back to their home country if they cannot get on the skills visa afterwards. So thank you so much, Stephen, for all the wonderful insights that you shared with us today. I've definitely learned so much. I'll be revisiting the slides in the presentation later as well. I'll be sharing with all my colleagues. For everyone who joined us today, just to reiterate that the webinar has been recorded. You can grab a copy of the slides from the handout section, or you can just revisit the recording later if there's anything that you want to watch back or remind yourself of. Just to say a warm thank you again to Stephen for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation and sharing all this information with our students. And then to remind the students that we'll be running more sessions throughout the month of March, please visit our website and sign up to more of our webinars, which are part of our Asia Careers Insight series. Thank you so much again, Stephen, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you all, and good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.